She called me controlling. Then I found the rental agreement. At first, that sounds like a clean sentence, the kind of line people use after they have already survived the worst part. It did not feel clean while I was living it. It felt confusing, humiliating, and almost impossible to say out loud. I kept looking for an explanation that would let my life stay intact. I wanted the truth to be smaller than betrayal. I wanted it to be stress, work, bad timing, or one of those ordinary rough patches people are supposed to survive. The problem was that my instincts had been collecting evidence long before my mind was ready to name it. For a long time, our marriage looked normal from the outside. That is the part people underestimate. Betrayal rarely announces itself with dramatic music. It hides inside routine. It sits beside shared bills, casual dinners, family plans, inside jokes, and the small habits that make two people feel permanent. When something changed, I did not immediately call it danger. I called it stress. I called it a phase. I called it anything that would not force me to admit that the person closest to me might be lying with a level of comfort I did not know she had. The early signs were easy to explain away because each one looked harmless by itself. A phone turned face down, a late reply, a sudden need for privacy, a schedule that shifted just enough to bother me but not enough to accuse. When I asked questions, she made me feel as if the real problem was my suspicion, not her behavior. That is how the ground starts moving under you. You are not only trying to understand the other person, you are trying to decide whether you can still trust your own reaction to what is happening right in front of you. I kept trying to be reasonable. That word trapped me for longer than I like to admit. Reasonable people do not jump to conclusions. Reasonable people give space. Reasonable people do not turn every uncomfortable moment into a courtroom. So I waited, I listened. I accepted explanations that sounded thin because accepting them let the house stay quiet for another day. But quiet is not the same thing as peace, and deep down I knew the silence in our home had changed. It was no longer calm. It was managed. The moment that moved everything from suspicion to evidence came through a rental agreement with her name and his emergency contact. I remember how ordinary the room looked when I saw it. Nothing exploded. No one screamed. The lights were the same. The furniture was the same. My body was the only thing that knew the world had changed. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. And for a few seconds I just stared at the proof, because I understood that once I accepted what I was seeing, I could never return to the version of life I had been protecting. That is the strange cruelty of a reveal. The object itself can be small, a message, a receipt, a calendar entry, a photo, a saved address, a line that was never meant for you, but the meaning behind it is enormous. It takes all the small doubts you were told to ignore and arranges them into a shape you can no longer deny. Suddenly the late nights have context. The defensive tone has context. The emotional distance has context. Even the moments when you apologized for asking questions begin to look different. You realize you were not paranoid. You were surrounded by fragments of a truth someone else kept breaking into pieces. I did not confront her immediately. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to walk into the room, hold up the proof, and force honesty out of her by sheer shock. But another part of me understood that people who lie comfortably do not become honest just because they are caught early. They adjust, they minimize, they delete, they cry, they turn your pain into a debate about your tone. So I stayed quiet long enough to understand what I was dealing with. The checking phase was one of the ugliest parts. It made me feel like a person I never wanted to become. I looked at dates, payments, messages, locations, and little details I once would have ignored without a second thought. Every confirmation hurt, but it also gave me a kind of bitter steadiness. I was no longer arguing with a feeling. I was building a timeline, and timelines are harder to gaslight than emotions. The truth widened faster than I expected. The apartment had been prepared before I even suspected the affair. That was when the betrayal changed categories for me. It was not a moment of weakness. It was not confusion. It was not some emotional accident that got out of control before anyone understood the damage. It had structure. It had planning. It had repetition. It had all the practical care that should have belonged to our marriage, redirected into protecting the lie. Once I saw the pattern, older memories started changing shape. Conversations I had replayed as misunderstandings became warnings. Arguments where I had felt guilty became scenes where I had been managed. Even kind moments became complicated because I no longer knew which version of her had been present for them. That is one of the parts people do not talk about enough. Betrayal does not only break the present, it reaches backward and makes you question the past you thought you owned. By the time confrontation became unavoidable, I was calmer than I expected. Not because I was untouched, but because the evidence had burned through the last pieces of confusion. I knew what I knew. I knew what could be denied only by insulting both of us. The confrontation happened in our home office after she called me controlling. I did not deliver some perfect speech. Real life does not give you clean dialogue when your chest is tight and your history is collapsing. I asked direct questions. I watched her face. I listened to the first explanation and heard the shape of every lie that would follow. The first response told me almost as much as the evidence did. She did not begin with full honesty. She began with control. There was surprise, then calculation, then the familiar attempt to reduce the size of what I had found. That is when I understood that exposure does not automatically create truth. Sometimes it only creates a faster version of the same manipulation. The person who hurt you may be less afraid of what they did than of what you can now prove. There was a moment in that conversation when the grief turned into something cleaner, not happiness, not relief, just clarity. I realized I was no longer asking whether I could survive losing her. I was asking whether I could respect myself if I stayed while knowing what I now knew. That question changed the room. It made every excuse sound smaller. It made every apology arrive too late. It made the future I had been protecting look less like love and more like fear wearing familiar clothes. The fallout was not cinematic. It was paperwork, phone calls, awkward explanations, money, boxes, sleepless nights, and the strange humiliation of telling other people that your private life was not what they thought. I had to separate practical decisions from emotional shock. I had to decide what to say, what to save, what to protect, and what to stop carrying. Betrayal does not end when the secret comes out. In many ways, that is when the real work begins. There is a particular kind of humiliation that arrives after the first shock fades. You start wondering who else noticed. You wonder who was quiet to protect themselves, who was quiet to protect her, and who simply did not know what to do with the pieces they had seen. That question can become its own wound if you let it. I had to remind myself that the shame belonged to the person who built the lie, not to the person who finally discovered it. The practical side was colder than the emotional side. Feelings wanted answers, but paperwork wanted dates. Feelings wanted a confession, but bank accounts, housing, messages, and family conversations demanded decisions. That contrast was brutal. I could be devastated in one moment and then forced to sound organized 10 minutes later. Betrayal makes you grieve while doing administration for the life that just collapsed. I stopped defending my instincts and started protecting myself. That decision did not make the pain disappear. It simply gave the pain direction. Instead of circling the lie, I started moving away from it. Some days that movement looked strong. Other days it looked like getting through work without falling apart. Healing was less dramatic than discovery. It was made of repeated choices that no one clapped for. Eating something, answering one necessary call, sleeping a little, refusing to reread old messages, and letting silence become protection instead of punishment. I also had to accept that closure would not come from her. That was hard. I wanted the clean confession, the full apology, the one sentence that would make the story morally understandable. But people who build long lies are often very bad at offering clean endings. They give fragments. They give excuses. They give regret only after consequences arrive. Eventually, I stopped waiting for her to explain the damage in a way that made it easier to carry. Recovery became less about understanding her and more about trusting myself again. I had ignored too many signals because I wanted to be fair. I had softened too many questions because I did not want to sound insecure. Rebuilding meant making a different promise to myself. Next time, I would not need a mountain of evidence before admitting that something felt wrong. I would still be calm, but I would no longer use calmness as a reason to abandon my own perception. What stayed with me most was not only the betrayal. It was the way one small clue forced my life to become honest. A rental agreement with her name and his emergency contact looked like a detail at first. It became the doorway into everything I had been avoiding. I wish the truth had arrived gently. It did not. but I am no longer sorry that it arrived. A painful truth still gives you choices. A comfortable lie will keep stealing from you. If there is anything I would say to someone living inside that kind of confusion, it is this: pay attention to the part of you that keeps trying to make the story make sense. Sometimes that part is not insecurity. Sometimes it is the last honest part of you trying to survive what the relationship has become. You do not need to be dramatic to protect yourself. You do not need to hate someone to leave. You only need to stop calling betrayal a problem you can fix by being more patient. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence is not small at all. It is the first honest thing in a life built around lies. And once you see it clearly, you have to decide whether you will protect the life you imagined or the person you still